Welcome again. Good evening. My name is Arwa Shobaki. I'm the Managing Director of the Middle East Democracy Center, also known as MEDC, and not MEDC, as I hear a lot of people saying. I just want to start the evening off by saying welcome. Thank you for joining us at our official launch party tonight. Today we wanted to bring together members of our community to celebrate MEDC's birth. Founded this year in January 2024, MEDC is a merger of the Project on Middle East Democracy and the Freedom Initiative, two organizations with more than 25 years of combined effort to support democracy and freedom in the MENA region. Our mandate is to challenge authoritarian systems, free the unjustly detained, and advocate for U.S. policies that protect human rights and advance a bold vision for democracy. Our merger and work has also unfortunately coincided with what could not be a more dangerous time for U.S. policymaking and its authoritarian regional allies that are becoming more apathetic and complicit in human rights abuses by the day. Since the October 7th Hamas attack, which killed more than 1,100 Israelis, and today counting upwards of 38,000 Palestinians. Thousands are at risk of famine. Millions have been displaced in Gaza by the Israeli war. The war is now a human rights and humanitarian catastrophe, and the Israeli hostages have not been returned, and a ceasefire deal remains elusive. Arab citizens across the region, across the world, are being arrested and censored for speaking out against these horrors and their own government silence. I know many of us here tonight have been personally and professionally impacted by the war, and I just want to say thank you for coming out tonight, and let's hope it ends. In tonight's short program, we will be hosting a couple of brief conversations with an excellent group of guests to discuss the importance of not giving up the fight for a more democratic MENA region, while also exploring new ways to advocate for these rights. We will follow these brief conversations with a reception and an opportunity for you all to spend time together. So I hope you find this program short, dynamic, and thought-provoking. Before we begin, I'd like to just run through some house rules. The event is all on the record. We are recording our program and conversations tonight. If you'd like to take photos or videos, please make sure that you have the permission of everyone in the photo, and have fun. I would now like to introduce MEDC's Executive Director, Tess McEnery, who joined POMED in the fall of 2022 and has since led a successful merger, built a new organization, and has endeavored to inspire our team, grappling with what many consider an absolute game changer for U.S. influence in the region. Luckily, Tess came to POMED with many years of high-level U.S. government experience under her belt, including the Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden administration. So Tess is no stranger to policy challenges, nor challenging working environments, which somehow seems appropriate for MEDC's mandate and the times. So Tess, the mic is yours.
First, I want to thank Arwa, who just spoke, for the kind introduction. MEDC would not exist without you, let alone me. You're my steadfast partner in this work. A great example, as all of us know in this room, that none of us do this work alone, ever. So, esteemed guests and friends and advocates of democracy, I'm so pleased to welcome you officially, because we have banners. You see them? We have banners. It's official, the Middle East Democracy Center. And I thought I would kick my remarks off by answering a question I get asked all the time, which is, why? Why did you do this merger? Why now? Why did you create MEDC? And I think the answer is actually deceptively simple, and that is, if not now, then when? When is it time? When is it time to be honest, to admit that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the freedom agenda, the war on terror, arms deals, and ignoring human rights in the region have not led to freedom and peace and prosperity. When is it the time to shake off decades of stagnating foreign policy and exhausted public opinion to make the case that human rights, human dignity, and the democratic aspirations of the people of the Middle East matter to them, to their children, their communities, their countries, and they also matter for the security and prosperity of the United States? When is the time to reckon with decades of oppression and conflict that ultimately led to the deadly Hamas attack in Israel and then Israel's war in Gaza that has killed, injured, and displaced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians? So when is the time? And MEDC has answered that the time is now. The time is now to make the case that democracy and human rights and freedom are not options, they're not nice to have, and they're not luxuries. They are the driving force for peace and security in the MENA and across the world. The time is now to discard rhetoric that has never been true, that the people of the Middle East are not ready for democracy, that they have tried already and they have failed, and that authoritarianism is preferable because it's stable and reliable. The time is now to live by the truism borrowed from the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us, centering the people of the Middle East in our own solidarity and advocacy. And the time is now to boldly and bravely face this scary inflection point of rising authoritarianism and war and oppression, and to issue a clarion call that democracy and human rights will prevail, it must prevail. The founding of the Middle East Democracy Center aims to do just this, to build on the rich legacies of POMED and the Freedom Initiative, and to be greater than the sum of our parts. So tonight at this launch with all of you here in our founding days, MEDC asks all of you in this room to join us, to do what seems impossible, especially now, to not be on the defensive, but to be on the offensive, to stand up proudly for our values and our convictions, and to forge strong and diverse coalitions of pro-democracy voices, uniting all of us in a common purpose that freedom and justice can prevail for all in the Middle East. With that message delivered, I am so happy to introduce the chair of the board of directors of MEDC, Anas Al-Jumaili. He's an entrepreneur and investor in media, entertainment, and technology. He has been an early investor in 6 unicorn companies, including Discord, and he's the co-founder of Gently, a disruptive logistics company in the United States. We are so very lucky to have Anas's clear-eyed leadership at the launch of MEDC. So Anas, over to you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Tess, for your kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Anas Al-Jumaili, and it's with great honor that I stand here before you today as the chair of the Middle East Democracy Center, or MEDC. Tonight, we celebrate a monumental occasion, the merger of 2 extraordinary organizations, the Freedom Initiative and the Project on Middle East Democracy. Having served as chair of the Freedom Initiative and now chairing MEDC, I've witnessed the profound and transformative impact both organizations have had individually. This evening marks the beginning of a new chapter, where we unite our strengths and resources to forge something even greater. The decision to merge was made with careful consideration and driven by a shared vision: to amplify our impact in these transformative and uncertain times in the Middle East, we are united, MEDC, by our unwavering belief that through collaboration, we can better support human rights defenders, promote democratic values, and tackle the urgent challenges facing the region. The merger is not merely a strategic alignment. It is a powerful testament to our unity and resilience. It embodies our dedication to the cause and our steadfast belief in the possibility of positive change. By joining forces, we enhance our ability to advocate for the voiceless, hold those in power accountable, and support the courageous individuals fighting for freedom and justice. As Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it is done. Our journey, marked by perseverance and hope, has brought us to this remarkable moment. Together, we stand stronger, ready to turn the impossible into reality and ignite the flame of democracy and human rights in the Middle East. I extend my deepest gratitude to our board, whose vision and guidance have been instrumental in bringing us to this moment. To our management team, Tess and Arwa, your leadership and dedication have been truly inspiring. And to our incredible team, our staff, partners, donors, thank you for your unwavering support and commitment. And to all of you present tonight, thank you for joining us, supporting us, and believing in our mission. As we look forward to this evening's discussions and the journey ahead, let us celebrate the launch of MEDC with optimism and determination. Together, we will continue to make a difference, championing the values of democracy and human rights in the Middle East. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Arwa, our managing director, who will introduce the panels for this evening. And thank you all once again for your attendance and for your support. Enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Anas. So I want to introduce our first guests who are going to focus their conversation on making the case for human rights and democracy in the MENA region. Our first guest is Dr. Thamer Ahmad, who we're so pleased to have here tonight. He's a board-certified physician, emergency physician, and board member for Med Global, a medical humanitarian NGO. Thamer traveled to Gaza on multiple trips, multiple medical missions, and since returning home to the U.S., he has spoken out about the dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza and made headlines when he walked out of a meeting with President Biden recently. Please, Thamer, welcome you to the stage. Joining Thamer tonight is Areej al-Sadhan. Areej is a Saudi-American human rights defender and sister of jailed humanitarian aid worker Abdurrahman al-Sadhan, who was forcibly disappeared in 2018 during a mass crackdown on critics and rights activists in Saudi Arabia. And he was sentenced to 20 years in jail and a 20-year travel ban in 2021. Areej has fought tirelessly for her brother's freedom and the freedom of all political prisoners in Saudi Arabia. Areej, thank you for being here tonight. And guiding our conversation tonight will be MEDC's Yasmin Omar, who's the director of our Democracy Matters initiative. Yasmin is an international human rights lawyer. She was a member of the Front to Defend Egyptian Protesters and a political activist in Egypt. She was forced to leave Egypt and live in exile here in the U.S. after being targeted for her work, like many other Egyptian human rights lawyers. Before joining MEDC, Yasmin served as a consultant with the UN, a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence and conflict. Thank you, Yasmin.
Thank you so much, Arwa, for the kind introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm Yasmin Omar. I'm a human rights lawyer and the director of the Democracy Matters Initiative, and I am honored and privileged to be among you today and to be having this conversation with Areej and Thamer. Well, we are facing an inflecting point in history, like Tess said. And violent crackdowns have led to worsened authoritarian systems in the MENA region. And from this point, we are witnessing a human rights crisis unlike anything that we've witnessed before. In Egypt, human rights abuses have reached an unprecedented level in Egypt's modern history. In Tunis, Qais Said, the president, has been praising himself as an authoritarian monger leader. And in Morocco and Jordan, they have been quietly jailing and imprisoning their journalists and defenders. Moreover, on the Gulf, in the UAE, has been conducting mass secret trials. In Saudi Arabia, there has been an increasing lengthy sentences, prison, enforced disappearances, and security deals towards normalization. And eventually, we are seeing Kuwait dissolving its own parliament undemocratically. And on top of all this, a vicious war in Gaza, Israeli war in Gaza, unprecedented atrocities, and we are seeing a humanitarian catastrophe. These authoritarian regimes have only strengthened their positions through support, international support, including the US, or on top of it, the US. And eventually, these regimes are seeking security deals and security agreements to offer false promise for stability. Circumstances, of course, are bleak. So there is hope for human rights and democracy in the region, and what stands in the way of getting the US to be on top of prioritizing human rights and democracy for people in the Middle East and North Africa? I want to start by the three of us as example. Well, the three of us have ties, different ties to the MENA, and whether you're Egyptian, Saudi, Palestinian, American, doctor, lawyer, human rights defender, we're working on the ground or in the diaspora, we are sharing grief and we are in shock and uncertainty about the future. And from this point, I wanted to start by asking Thamer, you are a Palestinian-American with first-hand experience of what happened in Gaza. You've witnessed so many atrocities in Gaza yourself and victims. And you witnessed this knowing that the US is funding and supporting the war on Gaza. You have been trying to advocate against the war. You even walked out on a meeting with President Biden to send a message against the war. And I wanted to ask you, when in your work, when you're trying to convince stakeholders in the US, what is the biggest challenges you have been facing, and what is the responses you've been receiving?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Thank MEDC for having this event and allowing me the opportunity to speak. You know, I think I've been doing this actually since October, where we've been trying to meet with different elected officials, people who have a say or have a seat at the table, that we like to say. And having gone to Gaza in January, being at Nasser Hospital and watching Nasser Hospital get surrounded and raided, and essentially the second largest hospital in Gaza become defunct because of the Israeli military operations there. I thought that an eyewitness testimony would make a difference, being able to come here and say, as an American, as somebody who was there, as somebody who was in danger and had a chance of also being killed like many of the Palestinian healthcare workers, I thought that there could be recognition of that. I think there's a few challenges. I think ultimately, one thing that I'd have to, and this is my opinion, of course, but there's this dehumanization of people in the Middle East and North Africa that's gone on for decades. And you hear it even from former Israeli prime ministers. Golda Meir said, there will be peace when they love their children more than they hate us. There's this idea when you think of a Palestinian man, the idea that they're more likely to be a terrorist who's salivating. And I see that penetrating the psyche of lawmakers and policymakers here in the United States. Yes, it's wrong. A hospital being bombed is wrong. A doctor being killed. An ambulance driver trying to save Hind in North Gaza while she's on the phone with a dispatcher for 5 hours is somehow there's a justification for that. I have to ask myself, if this was happening somewhere else, not in the MENA region, would it be that same sort of rationalization? I mean, the blatant hypocrisy that exists between the policies and the way that we respond to Ukraine and to things like Gaza speaks for itself. It's the fact that this region, for whatever reason, it's okay for children to be killed in this manner. There's some sort of rationalization. It's sad, it breaks our hearts. But is it going to change anything on the ground? We haven't seen that. 8 months of the most horrific humanitarian catastrophe since World War II. How has that not changed policy? How have we not realized that the admin before this one helped lay the groundwork for October 7th, and then this current admin has supported the ongoing aggression against the people of Gaza? So for me, I think part of it is that there isn't a recognition that the people in the Middle East are just like the people in the United States or in Europe. And then the second part of this also is that there is this counter narrative that's not being dispelled. So not as human as the rest of us, but also here's the story on the ground. Here's the explanation for everything.
Thank you, Thamer. And from your words, people matter in the MENA, whether it's in Palestine or Saudi Arabia or in Egypt. But our leaders are acting like we don't matter, and probably that's what encouraged other international forces to think that we don't matter as well. And from the point you've mentioned, I wanted to ask Areej, because Areej, your brother, was arrested and forcibly disappeared in 2018 over satirical tweets. And you have been a vocal advocate for him and other prisoners, deciding that the only option you had was to speak out publicly, despite the risk and attacks and threats you've been receiving. Well, during this time, there have also been a lot of major developments in Saudi Arabia and in the world, and changes in regards to US policy, specifically towards Saudi Arabia. What changes that you have seen recently in the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, and how was the US response? Where are we now?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. First of all, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and thank you to everyone who actually is here. It's very dear to me to be here to celebrate this very special event. Yes, to answer your question, how is the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia? Unfortunately, it has been deteriorating and getting worse every day. Every day there are cases of enforced disappearances. We've never seen deterioration like this before. Cases of lengthy draconian sentences and cases of torture, people being tortured in prison, women being harassed, raped in prison. It's just unbelievable and heartbreaking. My brother's story is probably one, and this is how I actually got to learn about all the other cases. At the beginning, we were lost. We didn't know what's going on. But then I started to learn about other cases and realized there's a pattern, actually. It's not just my brother's case. And Saudi Arabia today is not like Saudi Arabia before. Not to say that Saudi Arabia is getting better. Unfortunately, it's getting a lot worse when it comes to human rights. And what is changing is that Saudi Arabia today is actually sport washing, is becoming more expert in sport washing, using PR campaign, buying sports stars and movie stars to actually promote their image and whitewash MBS's image, especially after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So unfortunately, the situation in Saudi Arabia haven't got any better, especially when it comes to human rights. It's got a lot worse. I am a living testimony. My brother has been disappeared now for over 6 years. I haven't spoken to my brother or seen him for over 6 years. And since his sentencing in 2021, he is completely, disappeared. We're denied any communication with him.
I'm so sorry to hear this, Areej, and we all here feel for you and for your family. And from what you're saying that it got worse recently, I agree with you, because since the war on Gaza, we have been seeing increasing international indifference towards rising authoritarianism in the MENA, and therefore we have been witnessing new phenomena of human rights violations, such as those you mentioned. More importantly, like in November, Saudi Arabia executed 82 Saudis just in 1 day, because who cares? No one is going to ask. So I wanted to ask you both questions, given your capacity as Arab Americans, Saudi American, Palestinian-American. Well, how do you see the attacks on rights and freedoms in the MENA, and how it's implicating freedoms and human rights here in the US? Let's start by Thamer.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the blatant disregard for international humanitarian law in Gaza, for example, and even in the West Bank, the curbing of rights, the restrictions that you're seeing, it's establishing a dangerous precedent. It's going without any sort of accountability. You know, the fact that the hospital healthcare system was specifically targeted in Gaza, the fact that you have over 400 healthcare workers that have been killed, over 200 who have been detained, who have been abducted, I want to use that word. We're talking about a deliberate attempt to level an entire place, to make sure that people either leave the Gaza Strip or that they don't exist. And the fact that there is no accountability for that is establishing a dangerous precedent. I will remind everybody what happened in France a couple of days ago. We are watching the rise of more authoritarian, far-right groups coming to power, and that's going to cause irreversible effects for the generations to come. The fact that Gaza seems so far away, but to watch, and I will use quotes, a Western democracy carry out the atrocities that it's carrying out in the Gaza Strip with absolutely no consequences, to me it's establishing an incredibly dangerous precedent. I am very concerned not just about the future of MENA, I'm concerned about the future of the globe. This is having implications everywhere, and I'm reminded of people in Gaza when I was there, they don't refer to the West as the West anymore. They refer to it as the hypocritical world, al-alam al-munafiq. That's the way they refer to it now. It's not the West, it's not where Western values and democracy is being promoted, it's the hypocritical world. You will apply standards to some areas, but not in others. And I think that's going to be detrimental, not just to the US's interests, their strategic interests in the world, but to the future generations of the globe.
Thank you, Thamer. I wanted to ask you the same question, Areej.
Yeah, absolutely. It contributes a great deal to international repression. I've experienced that myself. So the more dictatorship can get away with human rights abuses, the more they are emboldened, and that means they can reach even international or cross borders repression. I've been threatened and I've been stalked and I've been actually intimidated by Saudi agents, whether online or in person. There have been 2 incidents where I was actually followed. So these are very serious. It brings these abuses here at home. It brings these abuses to Americans and to American soil. So it doesn't just stay there. Unfortunately, it's sad by itself that we have so many human rights abuses over there, and there isn't much influence that democratic countries or leaders can do to change the situation. But worse than that is actually coming here even to the democratic countries. So.
Well, we can't help but wonder what's standing in the way of getting the US government to prioritize human rights and democracy for the people in the region, knowing that it's implicating security here in the US, knowing that it's impacting the society here in the US. And like for you, Areej, you work with people to free your brother, you talk to people and you do a lot of efforts and still nothing changes. And for you, Thamer, you have been trying to advocate for the end and a ceasefire, an end of the war in Gaza. And I want to ask your opinion. What do you think standing in the way? Thamer first.
I think, obviously we're talking about US foreign policy that's been in place for decades, for multiple administrations, doesn't matter red or blue, they have all kind of maintained similar policies. And I think it's the people. I think it's the way that they think and how they look at the region there. I've spoken to so many different people, and there's so many things that only so many stories that I can share. I can tell you all about Dunya Abu Muhsin, the 12-year-old who's in Nasser hospital. Her whole family gets killed. Her leg gets blown off. She miraculously survives, only to be killed by an Israeli tank shell 2 weeks later in the pediatric ward of Nasser Hospital. I can only tell you about Salma, a 5-year-old girl who's walking. She was told, go to the south with your family, and she gets hit by a sniper. And her dad has to recount the story of she's jumping up and down, yelling in pain. I mean, everybody here can understand the kid jumping up and down, yelling in pain, but this kid is being killed in the process. It's not moving the people that we're talking to, the people who have been there forever. I mean, there are a lot of people who view the MENA world in the same lens as it was viewed post 9/11 as they do now 2024. And it's hard to change them. I don't know what else it's going to take, what sort of images you need to hear or see, or stories that you need to hear about. What are the facts? How many times does a Commission of Inquiry of Human Rights at the United Nations has to come up with some sort of report on this? How much more do we have to see to change? So I think it's the people that are in place now. That's the biggest challenge, because they're not getting it. And I feel like they have to go, and there needs to be people who do get it in their place.
I can't agree more with you, honestly. Areej?
Yeah, I think what's in the way is, and also to recount what Maher have mentioned, is also the US foreign policy, as the way I see it, is outdated. It needs to be updated to the current and emerging issues that are happening, from increased authoritarianism and to increased human rights abuses. So, and besides, I think there should be more and more voices being heard from the ground of what's going on, rather than just just going by the old laws and rules. So yeah, I mean, I ask that question every day. Why? Why? It's so obvious. It's so out there. Why it's okay? Is it okay for these human rights abuses to be committed? For example, we've heard President Biden say that he's going to make human rights the center of his foreign policy. Then a few years later, that have changed. It's like completely abandoned. It's no longer the center of human rights. The human rights is no longer the center of foreign policy anymore.
Will, you started us thinking on what is wrong, and I wanted to use this moment, and because you're here in this position now, what do you say to the US officials who say we have to make deals with authoritarian regimes to maintain stability, to make sure that there is no wars, there is no conflict? However, we always see wars and conflict. What do you say to them today?
Unfortunately, it's very disappointing to see human rights now is becoming nothing but transactional business. So when we say providing like military security guarantees to authoritarian regime, there's no way you can achieve human rights and stability in the region. It's the opposite. You can't have human rights while you're empowering dictators, while empowering people who are actually abusing human rights. So unfortunately, it goes it counter each other. It doesn't work. So if you want to have human rights and stability in the region, you gotta address the issues with this authoritarian regime. You gotta have them respect human rights and democracies that we claim to have before we can say we can bring stability and security in the region.
Absolutely. People think that democracy and human rights are separate things. We can pursue some developments on human rights. Hey, stop executing people, please, but continue to oppress them and not have fair elections and not have representative of all the nation. However, as you've said, I totally agree with you. We need to connect those together. There is no human rights without democracy. But I wanted to end by asking Thamer, when you walked out of the meeting with President Biden, you left with him a letter from an 8-year-old orphaned girl named Hadil in Rafah, begging for the president not to allow an invasion of Rafah. Now we're seeing what's going on in Rafah. Can you tell us how is Hadil? Is there any news?
Yeah, I have no idea. I have no idea. There are less, Rafah had 1.4 million people before this invasion that apparently that has not crossed this red line that the Biden administration has set. And they have continued to herd the Palestinian people around like sheep in Gaza. Go south, go west, go Mawasi, go Khan Yunis. And so I don't know what's happened to her. And for me, after seeing the tent massacre, after seeing the UN shelter being bombed, after seeing Al-Aqsa hospital be threatened to evacuate, I'm very concerned about Hadil and the many children like her. I mean, this is a population that prior to the war, Save the Children has a report that said 4 out of 5 kids in Gaza, because of the trauma that they've experienced in the last 2 decades, are either self-harming or having suicidal thoughts. What about right now? What about the more than 1 million children who have not been in school for 8 months, whose campuses at the university campuses have been destroyed? What's happening to them? So I think about Hadil and many of the children that I got to interact with all the time. I mean, what's happening to them and how will they remember what's taken place over the last 8 months? And if I can just make one point about what you just said, US officials need to understand these you use the word transactional, I think that's an excellent word. What you're doing is you are attacking the agency of the people in MENA. You are sidelining them. You're putting them to the side. They have no say, they have no voice. You're not just empowering authoritarian regimes and bringing stability. You're silencing these people. And now nobody has to think about them when they're making decisions. Nobody has to care what happens to them. And make no mistake, this is something that is not isolated incidents. You know, your brother is not an isolated incident. Al-Ma'madani Hospital, Al-Shifa Hospital, Nasser, they're not isolated incidents. These are all compounding on top of each other. And we will have to reckon with what we've created as a result of all of this.
Well, it can't end more strongly. You left us with images that move stone and hearts. I am, and everyone else in the room, in awe of your activism and advocacy. Please continue to do so and know that there is a whole community that supports you. Thank you so much.
It is our absolute pleasure to have Hala Rharrit here with us tonight, joining MEDC's Executive Director, Tess McEnery, for an important conversation. As many of you may know, Hala is a former American diplomat who most recently served as the Arabic language spokesperson for the State Department. Hala joined the Foreign Service in 2006 and began her career as a political officer and human rights officer in Yemen. Some of her other tours have included Hong Kong, Qatar, and South Africa. In April, Hala became the first U.S. diplomat to resign over the administration's position on the war in Gaza.
Hi, everyone. We're getting towards the end of the formal program. I know drinking and eating is in your future. So we've had some tumbles. We've had some spills. The enthusiasm is at 11. Can we get some claps for yourself? Let's get this energy up. Yes. Excellent. So glad to see a packed room and so glad that the last discussion stole a lot of our thunder by immediately examining U.S. foreign policy, which is what Hala and I will also do. But I want to build directly on what the last discussant said, which is that the United States government, its foreign policy, makes a lot of trade-offs. They trade away democracy and human rights for economics and security. And yet it seems that given these trades, the United States still doesn't get the security benefits, the access to oil, and all of the deals that they want. So they seem to be trading away democracy and human rights for very little in return. So with that comment to inspire us, I just wanted to ask you, Hala, having a career spanning, I mean, not just your recent posting, but across the Middle East and with deep Middle East expertise, what's your biggest takeaway from your career in the MENA about sort of the failures and impact of US foreign policy and what needs to change now?
Thank you, Tess. First of all, I just want to say congratulations on MEDC's launch. Really. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm honestly quite overwhelmed by the turnout, and I just want to thank you all for your interest and for coming out tonight, really. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. So my biggest takeaways really are twofold. One, that we don't learn from our mistakes. We unfortunately have not been learning from our mistakes. And two, that we are continuing to undermine and underestimate, for lack of a better word, the Arab street. Right? So when I joined the State Department 18 years ago, I had this notion of if only my government understood, if only they knew, if only they had additional information, they would make the right decisions. Unfortunately, I ended my career in resignation, so there's been a lot of frustration there. But we've all seen the trajectory over the last decades. Many of us had hope when Barack Obama had his famous speech in Cairo, and he said, we will prioritize human rights, we will prioritize democracy, and we understand that the only way to achieve true stability and really have partners in the Middle East that are sustainable is for us to prioritize that over security, over oil deals. But then we all saw how the Obama administration went. And then when President Biden was on the campaign trail, we all listened to the rhetoric specifically about Saudi Arabia and around Jamal Khashoggi and around the need for press freedom and human rights. And every time as a diplomat, I was proud, I had hope. I thought we would make a change finally. And I can say some of our rhetoric has changed, especially under democratic leadership, but our policies have not. They've remained the same, no matter if it's a Bush White House, a Trump White House, an Obama White House, and now a Biden White House. And that has been absolutely devastating to see. And we see that it is to our detriment as the US government. And that has been my point, and as Tess has mentioned. It's not a matter of we're promoting human rights and democracy because we want to be nice to the Arabs. It's because it is a fundamental human rights issue, and it is also in our own US national security. It's that simple and it's that clear, and we continue to see a situation in the Middle East that is perpetually unstable. And that leads to my second point of we continue to underestimate, for lack of a better word, the Arab street. There's always this notion that at the leadership level, we make deals, right? Or in this latest instance, Secretary Blinken flies in, he shakes some hands, he makes some concessions, he hits some promises, and he leaves, assuming that things will remain quiet. Part of my role as Arabic language spokesperson was to monitor Arab media. And although this was not shown on traditional Arab media, such as the pan-Arab outlets, it was shown on social media, the growing unrest throughout the Arab world, protests practically in every country. Yet as a US government, I can tell you from where I sat just a month ago, the State Department is not focused on that. Still, the State Department is not planning what are we going to do about this social unrest? Just like before the Arab Spring, all of a sudden, why are millions of people protesting in the streets? What's going on? Why are these regimes being toppled? Yet we continue to underestimate the populations across the Arab world. And again, it is to the detriment of our own US national security interests. So my two takeaways, not the most hopeful, but.
Thank you, Hala. And I forgot to mention at the outset that you have the rare pleasure of having two former, longtime US government officials up here. So our level of pessimism and jadedness hopefully has not suffused the room.
We'll end in hope. We'll end
in hope, I promise. We'll end this discussion in hope. But I really wanted to build on what Hala said, which is, we are at this terrible inflection point, the war in Gaza, like everything that's going on, but in a way, it's a continuation of what we've seen for decades and through administrations. I was in, as Arwa mentioned, since the George W. Bush administration, since the Freedom Agenda, since lip service to democracy and human rights. In fact, weaponizing democracy and human rights as reasons for invasion, as reasons for death and destruction. And so this narrative, this approach is not foreign or unknown to all of us who stand up for democracy and human rights in the region. And something I will say as well about the national security issue that I know Hala and I are both touching on is that not only is supporting democracy and human rights the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, it is also what you do for the safety and security of your own country, of the globe, of the region, of countries in the Middle East, and that is a connection that has been lost for so long. You still see it with the war in Gaza, that the Abraham Accords and normalization with Saudi and a deal with Saudi that involves civilian nuclear power and a security guarantee that would tie us to responding to any and all threats that Saudi ever faces, which is fundamentally a huge change in foreign policy, a fundamentally huge change for what the United States would be responsible for and involved in the region, are floated as reasonable, doable foreign policy choices just in general, and now in response to a massive, massive human rights and humanitarian crisis. So we just feel this snowball effect of the previous discussants as well, saying it's been decades and the dehumanization continues, and this lack of understanding continues. So on that topic, we obviously can't get away specifically, Hala, from why you resigned. Obviously, the administration's support for the Israeli war in Gaza, provision of arms, its rhetoric. And so I wanted us to dive into what are the practical consequences of US foreign policy in the war in Gaza? What are the practical consequences for affecting the security and prosperity of the United States, of people in Gaza, Israel, and the region?
The consequences are absolutely disastrous, and consequences that I, in my 18-year career, never imagined seeing. So when I joined the State Department, I started off my career in Yemen. That was not an easy time. It was at the height of Gitmo, the most amount of population in Guantanamo were Yemenis. You know, it was never easy to be an American diplomat in the Arab world, right? But I would say this is the worst time that I've ever seen, including the Gulf War, in terms of how much disappointment, and I would also say the word hatred towards the United States there is right now in the Arab world. And for me, as an American diplomat, and obviously as an Arab American, it's devastating. It's devastating to get to that place, especially when we had made so much progress, at least on a people-to-people tie. But what I've been explaining to people in the government when I was still in, and now what I've been doing this week at the Hill, is explaining how much we've lost full credibility. And our esteemed guests earlier discussed this. When we are going against our own values of freedom of press or human rights, we are undermining our own credibility. We have no more respect. No one in the Arab world at this point, and I know I'm speaking in generalities, but really has respect for anything that we say anymore, and that's a devastating consequence. And I would say, as I mentioned, in terms of the social unrest, it's destabilizing. It's destabilizing to the entire region. So it's not just about Gaza, it's not just about Israel, and obviously we could talk for hours about the devastation on the Palestinian people themselves. But it's the entire MENA region at this point is impacted and is destabilized by what's going on. And that is, again, going back to this is all a threat to our own US national security.
Yeah, thank you, Hala. And I think to that point of this is bigger than Gaza, and this is bigger than the war in that it affects our security in the United States, but also the region, is that human rights defenders and democracy advocates across the region are also suffering these consequences. You talk to anybody in Egypt, Tunisia, the Gulf, is that the war in Gaza dominates their treatment in their own countries, their feelings of safety, their ability to protest their own treatment or protest the war in Gaza. We saw like 18 Egyptian women protesting the war in Sudan, protesting the war in Gaza, arrested by state security services in Egypt because they were protesting, right? So in exercising their fundamental freedoms and their human rights in their own countries has become even more dangerous because of the war in Gaza and its ripple effects. And so this gets to something I think that Thamer said, which is this is about not just democracy even in the MENA, this is about democracy globally, crisis of credibility, the crisis of does it matter? Our team talks to human rights defenders across the region who said, if a country like the United States, if Western allies can just be okay with hundreds of thousands of people being displaced and killed and all of this, and in fact aid and abet it, and say at the same time that democracy is at the center of their foreign policy, why should I endanger my life to stand up for it? Why should I make myself extremely vulnerable to stand up for this when I know I will get no support and in fact be put in greater danger? So it's a crisis of confidence and partnership with the United States government and with the United States people and with the United States NGOs like MEDC and others in this room that we're facing with this war. So this has been sort of a bad news parade, which I understand, and none of us are unfamiliar with the bad news parade. So I want to try to do what Hala promised at the beginning and see if we can end on a positive note, which is Given all this hopelessness, given this inflection point where it really feels like support for democracy and human rights has sort of spiraled out of control, what can we do about it? How can we affect change, even incremental small steps that we know we're building to something greater?
You should just resign. Just kidding. Just kidding. I absolutely am not advocating for people to resign. That was a joke. In all seriousness, use your voice. Use your voice. And I don't say that just, casually. I think we all underestimate the power of our own voice. From the very beginning of the crisis, I was a spokesperson based out in Dubai. And so I was supposed to be one of the faces of the US government in the Arab world. So before this actual, I'm not going to call it a crisis, I'm not going to call it a war, I'm going to call it a genocide, was before I had done well over 100 interviews on Arab media. But after the conflict began, and I could see the rise of anti-American sentiment, and I could see the fact that our talking points were being utterly rejected by the entire region, I refused to do interviews. Because again, as a diplomat, my job was not just to follow orders and do what I was told. It was to advance US foreign policy. It was to advance US interests. But when we see that something is contrary to that, say something, do something. No matter what your particular position is, use your expertise. And I think there is a climate of fear right now across not just the government, but our entire society. And I can tell you it was very telling for me after my resignation became announced internally, because before it was announced externally, while I was still working, but I just had a couple weeks left, so many diplomats came to me and said, thank you. You speak out when you leave. But it actually made me so sad because they all were too scared to speak out. That's not who we are as Americans. That should not be who we are as a country. And that is not an effective government. An effective government is one that hears from its experts, that hears from its citizens, that hears from its bureaucrats. And that's what makes us stronger. We hear this rhetoric from Secretary Blinken. Honestly, in my experience, it was not the case that it was necessarily welcomed, but because there's this climate of fear. And I think if more people collectively begin to use their voice, that will change. So break through that fear. Break through it. Speak to your colleagues. Speak to others in other agencies if you work at a particular government agency. It's very hard as a government employee to also get fired. I'm not advocating for anybody to do anything, but I'm saying it is true. It's hard. We are at such an unprecedented time that everyone's voice matters. So go extra and beyond. If you work at a particular government agency, go and meet with NGO. Use a collective, and don't be scared to do so. There is more power in your voice than you think. And the last thing I would say is know your audience, right? So just to give you an example, I've had meetings on the Hill all week this week. And I framed all of my conversations in terms of US national security interests. I did not discuss the plight of the Palestinians because unfortunately, as it's been mentioned, Palestinians have been dehumanized, and I don't want to feed into that. But if you are a congressperson that still has not been moved by the fact that 15,000 children in Gaza have been massacred, I don't think a conversation with me is going to change your mind on that, unfortunately. But the threat to US national security might. And that is a true threat. It is something that has been overlooked, and it is something that we all, as a collective, need to discuss. Because there's been this us versus them narrative. Push back against this us versus them. It's not about that. It's about humanity, and it's about the United States and what's good for us and what's good for the collective, including Israel, including the Palestinians, including the broader Middle East and North Africa. So those are a few words that I would say.
Thank you, Hala. We're getting to the end now. It's very exciting. You can smell the sliders. And I just wanted to reinforce what Hala said, which is it's very hard in a dehumanizing, awful space in which we work to think that there can be no progress. But progress is incremental and progress is pragmatic. Progress is talking to government officials and congresspeople of all political parties, of tailoring your message. Progress is finding people in this room who you work with or maybe who you don't work with, other NGOs, other advocacy groups, other democracy implementing partners, and building community and building solidarity and finding opportunities to collaborate, finding venues where you can talk to either senior or mid-level people in the administration, in the government, not just the State Department, not just USAID, maybe Commerce, maybe Treasury, maybe the Department of Defense, people who want to listen, people who will take your facts and your information and even nudge just a little bit, because that's the business of democracy and human rights. I think all of us have realized it is the business of nudging. It is rarely the business of transformation, but to get to that transformational point, all the authoritarians collaborate with one another, so all of us have to collaborate with one another.
You're here.
So thank you for coming. Back to Arwa to close us out. And thank you, Hala. Thank you.
I'm not really sure what else I need to say. Thank you, Tess. Thank you, Hala. That was great. You've given us a lot to think about. But before we end our formal programming, we wanted to take the opportunity to thank our amazing staff that have helped to make this evening. Also, a special thank you to our videographer, Cliff Matheson and company. Thank you so much. We also want to thank all the congressional staffers and members of the administration who are here tonight. We may say stuff you don't always like, but we appreciate you being here and listening to us. We also want to thank our generous donors who, if not for them, we would not be here. Open Society Foundations, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the National Endowment for Democracy, Humanity United, Reprieve, among some of the few. Thank you so much. We want to say MEDC operates on the fundamental principle that people of the region, the MENA region, are best placed to advocate for the reforms needed to defend democracy and human rights, and we deeply appreciate all of the brave advocates that are in our community here tonight and around the world, and thank you, and please enjoy the sliders and everything else there. Thank you so much for coming tonight.